Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stacy Fox with the Open Minds Market Intelligence team, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Circle Elite Executive Roundtable. With performance management, timing is everything, acting before it's too late. Today, we have our featured speaker, Ken Carr, and he is joined by Open Minds Senior Associate Ray Wolfe. Ken brings more than 20 years of finance, technology, data analysis, and reporting experience in the health and human service fields to Open Minds. In his role of senior associate with the Open Minds consulting practice, he has served as a subject matter expert, leading numerous engagements in strategic planning, merger and acquisition prospecting, business process improvement, financial analysis of service lines, and technology selection. Prior to joining Open Minds, Carr was Chief Financial Officer of the Centers, a community mental health center in Florida, and led a realignment of the organization's financial management function. Ray Wolfe serves as an Open Minds Senior Associate as well, bringing over 40 years of experience in the health and human services sector. His expertise includes financial analysis and management, mergers and acquisitions, performance improvement, and strategic planning. He spent 22 years with Pittsburgh Mercy Health Systems in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, prior to joining the Open Minds team. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. While your audio is muted during today's briefing, we do encourage you to submit questions to our presenters who will be happy to answer at the end. There is a function within the GoTo system for you to do so on the right-hand side of your screen. The slides and recording from today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website tomorrow, and we encourage you to download and share with your team. Ken, I will turn it over to you and Ray.
Thank you, Stacey.
Hi, Ken. Hi, how are you? I've always enjoyed our times with doing joint presentations because both of us think so similarly around financial needs and problems. And I think that there are two important items that I just simply want to mention about this before we begin. First, there probably has never been a more important time in our industry, and you and I discussed this when we were together in Gettysburg, than right now for organizations not only to have strong financial performance to assure growth, but strong financial performance simply to survive. To be in a place where we can guarantee to our staff and to the people we serve that we can make it, that we can make a 5-year commitment to their needs or a 10-year commitment to their needs. And that's never really been the case before. Secondly, I really like the formats that have been developed and that you and I have worked on so heavily. And I really love this present iteration of it, which I think is probably the easiest I've seen to communicate. It fits my 3 themes of the process, which is it has to be easy to do and quickly producible. It has to be understandable, and these visuals tend to be. And thirdly, it has to drive action. So, you know, given that kind of background and the sense that we both have about this urgency, I want to turn it over to you now and let you get into the content of this presentation.
Thanks, Ray, and I enjoy presenting with you as well. I think you and I have worked with a number of organizations in this sector of specialty healthcare organizations and done any number of things, from helping with the revenue cycle, some strategy work around financial realignment and portfolio analysis. And so I think the experiences we both bring together will be helpful today as we talk a little bit about performance management, particularly in that financial area. And, you know, even as I look at the title, I think it's important to remember timing is everything. In our market, things can change very fast. And so having some tools like we're going to talk about today, some metrics to monitor, some process, some strategy to utilize to do some analysis is key. And we need to be doing it all along the way, not just every 6 months or when we get those annual statements or on a quarterly basis, but have these tools for analysis built in on a monthly and even shorter time frame so that we are moving rapidly as our environment changes. So with that, I would like to talk a little bit then today about our focus here, starting in particular around some key financial ratios. So if we're monitoring performance, what are the ratios we should use? Why are they important? And how can we put those together? Secondly, based upon these ratios, there are some ways that we can assess, are we a strong organization or are we vulnerable? And there are a couple of indexes that you and I have used that I want to be able to talk through because they take the ratios and move them to a different level of analysis around strength and vulnerability. And then this last section, once we've done the analysis, we've looked at our financial performance, kind of have some sense on where we're strong and where we're vulnerable, what do we do about that? How do we begin to move into strategy? And there are a number of steps that we can take, but the one we want to focus on today, and I think is always a starting point, is looking at our service portfolio. And at that point, I think we'll pass it to you to talk a little bit about that service portfolio analysis piece. So with that, let's just begin to move through this concept of, first, how do we measure performance? Secondly, how do we use metrics to really assess where we're at, where we're vulnerable, and then we'll move into the portfolio analysis piece. So when we talk about these financial indicators of strength, the metrics themselves kind of focus on profitability and liquidity and debt level and some of these traditional ways of assessing an organization. But I do think that we also need to be considering aspects of the organization, such as how concentrated is our revenue among different sources. So how risky is our revenue base? Do we have just one major payer or one major service line? And if something happens to that payer or service line, we become at risk. And so revenue concentration is very important. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the vulnerabilities piece. And then organizational size. We talk a lot about organizational size. Large organizations do have some economy of scale, some ability to do things more efficiently. And so organizational size plays into it, especially in the market as we move into fiscal year 2022. And there's this need to invest in technology because when we develop a new service, it needs to be technology first. If we're building that service, how can we integrate technology to make it efficient, to help us measure the results, and to have it be as effective for our consumers as possible? One of the ways that we can invest in technology is making sure we have the scale to bring in capital, and not just capital, but the talent, the workforce bench strength that's going to be necessary. So, we're going to look about profitability. Profitability is really key, especially for not-for-profit organizations, because if you're building capital, it's going to come from your past profits. It's going to come from contributions and some fundraising. It's going to come from incurring some debt. And there are different ways you can pull together that debt, but profitability is really key. Liquidity, having enough cash is important. We're going to actually start by talking about liquidity, and then debt level. And what's that ideal debt level? Having too much debt can bring risk, but there is a sense in which some debt leverages us to build for the future. And so looking at those three areas, or those three key areas, and then concentration and organizational size.
Ken, when I look at that and how you've grouped them, I really like it because the first three, profitability, liquidity, and debt level, really define an organization's capability to buy technology and to integrate into the future. Revenue concentration and organizational size both make it more difficult, if you're on the wrong side of that, to make a technology purchase. So the balancing of those first three and generating the kind of positive numbers in those areas that we need may overcome some of the problems we have in our industry of being 90% dependent on a Medicaid payer, or being of such a small size that our administrative numbers can't get to a low level. Therefore, we can't compete with others with the monies we're spending on programs staff. And I think those 5 integrate beautifully into working that solution. And I hand it back to you at this point with simply that comment.
Yeah, and we'll come back to these indicators of strength as we look at assessing vulnerability and strength of an organization. But let's dive first into this area of financial performance metrics. And you and I, Ray, have done a lot of putting together of our financial assessment and what ratios go into assessing and what are those metrics. And we've divided those into 4 different areas: liquidity, profitability, leverage related to debt. And then this next area is process efficiency. And so let's dive a little bit into how do we measure these? Why are they important? What can we learn from these particular metrics as we're analyzing our organizations? We talk about liquidity. Liquidity is cash. And so, liquidity flows, and the more cash you have, the more enabled you are to invest, to withstand difficult times, having some cash on hand. And there's 3 standard measures I think that are important. First is that the current ratio, which is really looking at our current assets. Our current assets are anything that has value over the next that we can convert to cash over the next 12 months, basically. That's the accounting definition. And so we're looking at cash, we're looking at accounts receivable. Those are really the big areas that we have. We may have some other prepaid things and the like, but cash and accounts receivable. And so we look at those current assets because that's what we have to pay our obligations as they come due. But we also want to consider our current liabilities. So that's anything that we owe and we know we're going to have to pay within the next 12 months. So that's our accounts payable, that's our accrued payrolls, maybe some other accrued payable items to organizations. It even includes, if we have some long-term debt, how much of that long-term debt are we going to pay over the next 12 months? And so we put those current assets into a bucket, we put those current liabilities into a bucket, and we then divide that out. And ideally, we want to always have more current assets than liabilities, but the ratio that I've used over the years and many years and in various industries is we want to have twice as many current assets as we do current liabilities. So a ratio of 2 to 1 is very important. If it's below that, I want to kind of understand, why are my current liabilities maybe higher than they should be, or should my cash be higher? Where am I at in terms of generating revenue and having that be in recognized in receivables? So current ratio is really key. And if we want to get really tighter on that ratio, we look at the quick ratio, which is basically just looking at cash, marketable securities, and accounts receivable, just those very easily converted assets, moving them into cash. And there, having a ratio of at least 1 to 1, a little higher, that's a pretty strong quick ratio. So those are ratios that I think make comparability of my organization to another. And so if I want to take a look at my current ratio and compare that to my competitors or the industry average, that's a very comparable type of metric. The other thing that I think is important is that days of cash on hand. And so if I take my cash and I divide that by how much cash do I need on a daily basis. So I look at my expense budget for the year. I take out the non-cash items like depreciation, or I'm amortizing something. and then I look at what are my cash expenses and divide by 365, I know on a daily basis what my daily cash is going to be. And so I can take my cash, divide by that daily cash number, and end up with how many days of cash do I have. Ideally, I think an organization should be at about 60 days. In my experience, organizations at 30 to 45 days are getting a little lean on cash. And if I really want to prepare for value, or if I want to have some cash to invest in growth, I want to be at least 90 days. And so that's a really, I think, important figure. And one of the first things I do when I look at an organization's statements is I calculate that day's cash on hand. And the other thing I will say, Ray, before I love to hear a little bit of your insight around these ratios, but I think that I'm very careful nowadays because I look at an audit and I calculate the day's cash on hand. I'm very careful to pull out how much of that is PPP funds, because I think as we move forward, some of the federal funds have helped organizations be sustained through the last 18 months or so. But moving forward, we need to have a real idea of how strong we are with cash without those funds, which won't be available into the future.
I think that's important to note. I think that we have all been lulled to sleep by those impacts where first we have a very high level of cash, and then the next year, as the loan is forgiven, we suddenly find ourselves with a lot of revenue. But those aren't sustainable. They're one-time events. These three ratios in general are known by everyone in the industry. You can take this to a banker, you can take this to members of your board who work in business. They'll understand exactly what they mean. Days in cash for me has had a little bit of a special significance because it was the one that I could use to explain things most clearly to staff. They understood the idea that if I had no additional cash coming in at all, I could last this number of days before I'd have to borrow. And that kind of logic to them made them kind of watch those numbers and understand and feel them a little differently.
And I like your comment about you can take it to the board, you can take it to the bank, because our ability to raise capital is one of the key considerations the CFO moving into this year needs to be thinking about. How are we going to grow? Where's that capital going to come from? And being able to speak to your liquidity ratios is a big part of that. When we come to the profitability ratios, certainly our net operating profit ratio is important. So understanding what percent is our bottom line, our income from operations, as we compare that to our revenue. And I know a lot of organizations struggle to keep that in the positive area. And I do think if you're a strong organization, you are looking at, if you're a nonprofit that wants to create opportunity for growth, you need to be at least 5%. And if you're a for-profit, of course, you're driving an even higher return. But that net operating profit is really important to be monitoring as well. The return on assets, really understanding, what's the return for the assets, for the investment you've made in the organization. What kind of return, if you're a for-profit organization, what kind of return are the contributors, the owners getting? But even in terms of utilizing the public dollar as a nonprofit, I want to be able to speak to what's the return on the assets that have been contributed to my organization, and how am I utilizing them, not just to impact consumers, but to build a strong organization. Likewise, the return on equity, looking at our net margin and dividing that by our net assets. Once again, and comparing that to the industry, and I've used an industry standard of 15 to 20% in the last, in terms of having a benchmark to use. But profitability, and we need to be monitoring profitability. I'm working with them. I spent the morning looking at some statements for an organization that has consistently over the last 3 years been running a profit. And then looking at the first 6 months of their new fiscal year that ended in December, there is a major deficit. And so, you know, looking at, that's one of the first things I wanted to look at was, has that profitability continued? If not, what is that related to? And then I can dig down into revenue. Is this a utilization issue? Is this related to COVID? Is this a billing and revenue cycle issue? Is this an expense issue related to staffing? And so monitoring profitability is that first step for being able to dig down and understand what's happening in the organization.
You know, Ken, I have a recent convert to the net operating profit benchmarks that you set. I lived in an atmosphere 3 or 4 years ago before I retired where for an organization our size, 2%, 2.5% profit was as good as anybody in the industry was doing, and it was fine. But that environment was more stable. That environment did not have the kind of dangers about state funding that we have today. It did not have the inclusion of MCOs and other payer models into the system. It didn't have the demands on us for cash to use for rapid change, for technology, for development of new service lines. So I agree now that if you're not hitting a 3, 4, 5, or at least a 4, that you are really missing the mark and should make adjustments to your efficiency levels in order to get to that place.
And Ray, as you were talking, I'm reminded of some of my work as a CFO in the past, and an organization in particular where we would fundraise for $1 million a year in order to have our net excess. And it was important for us to be looking at what's the net profit operating profit ratio. So on an operations basis, take out that contributions, because if we are really running a 3% deficit and we're fundraising to get to a 1 or 2% net excess, there are some problems with our portfolio of services and the profitability of them that we need to be addressing. And so really looking at that operations side, the revenue and the related expenses is important.
Yes.
You know, this third area on leverage ratios, I mentioned earlier, debt isn't always bad and debt isn't always good. The benefit of debt is utilizing it to leverage the organization for growth and stability, but growth in particular. And so understanding the ratio of debt that we have, the level of debt for the size of our organization is going to be key. And so there are some debt ratios here. You know, looking at our total liabilities and dividing that by our total assets really gives us this debt ratio overall, and utilizing a benchmark of 0.4, about 40%, is important. Looking at debt, comparing it to our equity, or what we've built in terms of past profitability and contribution into our net assets, that's important. So looking at total assets and dividing by our net assets. And there I'm looking at a ratio of less than 2 to 1. And then looking at debt service, our coverage ratio, where we're really looking at our operating income and dividing that by our debt service. How much are we paying on debt on an annual basis? There we also want to compare to having more operating income than the total debt that we have. And so those are three metrics that I think are important. One, what's our debt compared to our total assets? What's our debt compared to our net assets or our investment in the organization? And then looking at how much debt do we have ongoing that we have to pay out of our operations, because if we've invested a lot in property, for instance, and our debt service is very high, our need for profitability prior to that debt service is increased. And so having the right mix is important. If I have a high debt service and I begin to have revenue issues, I have high debt service because I am primarily a residential services provider, and we run into a pandemic and my utilization tanks, I've got some issues covering that debt. And so understanding our leverage ratios and managing those so that we get the best benefit of debt to grow the organization without creating undue risk is important.
What you said, though, about debt not always being a bad thing, I think is really something people need to hear. I know of organizations that don't have debt on residential services because they lease everything, and that those leases have long-term obligations, but they're not really mortgaging of debt. The question is, what did you use your debt for? If you borrow against assets in order to hide or get through a short-term efficiency problem, inability to create a profit, this continual series of losses, then that's a waste. If you are managing your debt in a way that you can make a significant contribution towards a new service line that's technology enabled, a new effort and growth, then I think your debt has meaning. And these metrics provide us benchmarks to determine how much we can afford in each of those areas as we plan for the future. But CFOs have got to understand that a certain amount of debt, if used correctly, is a positive impact on the company.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I've been a CFO in organizations where we had very low debt and had a bit of an executive debate around, shouldn't we take on more debt? Because we're an organization that weren't growing as fast as we could have. The bankers said we had a lot of dry powder, ability to take on more debt, and yet we tended to be very conservative. And so balancing out the ability to take debt to grow where we know there's opportunity is part of that strategy that we as CFOs need to be driving on that strategy discussion in the organization. And then this last area, Ray, is around the process efficiency ratio. So, we looked at cash, and cash is so very important, having as much cash as we can. Secondly, we looked at, leveraging the organization and debt, but this area of process efficiency is important too. And you and I, as we've looked at the various efficiency ratios, kind of landed on these top three. One is the accounts receivable turnover. So looking at accounts receivable in particular. So how many times a year, and this is kind of a standard for the industry, in any industry. So how many times in the year are we turning over our AR, right? Because the higher, the better. So the more times we're turning over our accounts receivable, the better that's going to be. It's going to be, we really have an efficient process, but we can also take that ratio and look at it based upon a daily basis. So 365 divided by that ratio that we've come up with to understand how many days of revenue do we have outstanding. And of course, I think, the gold standard is being as close to 30 days as possible. And realizing that if I've got AR of 30 days, it may have taken me a week or two to deliver the service, to make sure that service got documented, that we were able to scrub those claims and send them out. That may have taken me 3 days, that may have taken me 2 weeks. If it took me 2 weeks and I've got a 30-day outstanding AR, then I'm actually 45 days from the point that I delivered that service, I incurred salary costs. And so this is an important factor, but I think it's important to understand that our actual day from service to collection may be longer than that. And so 30 days I think is great, up to maybe 45 days depending. But once an organization begins to approach 60 days, I think that there are some issues going on with the revenue cycle. And then this last efficiency ratio is just around, what's the right level of administrative expenses, the ability to drive our infrastructure around finance, around HR, technology. So what's that right level and percentage of administrative management and general expenses, some of our executive staff, as a divided by those total expenses. And once again, I think that should be under 25%. But often I've come to view this as a bit of a range, because I think if you are under 10 to 12%, you may be a little too lean to be getting the best value out of that administrative overhead. And you certainly don't want to be over 25%. So I think these efficiency ratios are important. And the other one I don't have here, but looking at how many days does it take to pay my accounts payable, to pay what I owe, because once again, that's an opportunity to build cash. If we're paying everything the minute the invoice comes in the door, we're probably not holding on to as much cash as we could if we were looking at those invoices and paying them when they're due, which could be in 30 days. So, managing cash in the door, cash out the door, and then what's the administrative structure? Those are 3 or 4 actually process efficiency ratios I think we need to be monitoring on an ongoing basis.
Ken, the one I tend to have a little bit different gut feel about is the management and general overhead ratio. I agree that you can get too lean, and often for smaller organizations, 10 or 12% might be fine for larger. But the way I see it, if you're looking at, for example, a day program or a residential program, every one of your competitors is paying roughly the same amount for salary. They're staffing the same way because that's governmental regs. They're paying the same for benefits, the same square footage costs for rent and utilities. So there really isn't a place for you in those administrative costs to be a standout or to be stronger than your competitor. But if you can bring that cost of delivering a unit down by reducing your administrative portion, you haven't hurt the quality of that service delivery at all, and you've improved your capabilities when times get tough and potential cuts occur. You improve your capabilities to be the last man standing, the person who can continue these programs when others have to drop out. So I'm inclined, depending on the size of the organization, to talk about really putting some pressure on that 25% benchmark and moving it down if possible.
Yeah, and I like your comments around benchmarking. So if your administrative costs are much higher than those of your competitive organizations, then that's a concern, and you need to pursue that. I like your concept too of using that as a target. So, to target a certain percentage and figure out how could we get there. Maybe there's technology we could use that could drive that administrative expense down. And I do think some of it's related to the size of the organization. A larger organization can have a much lower overhead. That's the whole economy of scale piece. And so utilizing 1% benchmark for every organization really does not make sense. It really depends on the size of the organization as well. But really good insights there, Ray, in using that particular metric. I want to take a few minutes just to talk about, we have these metrics, but how do we really assess, is my organization strong? Is it able to weather some difficult times or not? Or are we vulnerable? And there are a couple of indexes that I know at Open Minds we've integrated into our financial sustainability assessment. And the financial sustainability assessment, that we put together to help organizations kind of look at where you're at. One is the credit strength indicator, the other is the financial vulnerability index. And I know you've done a lot of work with the credit strength indicator. It looks at the net margin, how much cash are you generating, and it assigns a value to that. It looks at your ratio of revenue to cover debt. We talked about debt service and how important it is to manage that debt service piece. So this ratio takes that into account. So do you have a good level of debt, or is your debt higher than maybe it should be for the revenue you're earning? It looks at your ratio of assets to liabilities. We talked earlier about, the current ratio, for instance. You want to have many more assets than you do liabilities. That's a strong position to be. And then it looks at your months of cash. So, how liquid are you? And this credit strength indicator takes all of those, it applies some percentages, and it compares those then to various bond ratings. And so, you put those into a formula. This is actually built into our financial sustainability index now. And so here's an example of an organization where we took those 4 figures, we put those into the calculation. And for this organization, it showed that they have some long-term sustainability. And so this is a good indicator of strength compared to bond ratings in particular. If you end up in the 5 to 7 range, then you're going to have some short-term stability issues. You may be at high risk if another pandemic comes along. You may be lacking on cash. That may have been driven because you have low cash, or maybe you have high debt. And so utilizing an index like the credit strength indicator, I think, is important for us using those metrics to assess where you're at.
These ratings actually came from credit bureaus, not credit bureaus, but brokerage firms that do credit ratings on major bond issues. So the numbering scheme here is something that is reasonably well developed and understood industry-wide across all finance areas. I was interested when I first started using this is what was the average for our industry? Where did we hit? And I think that the number is definitely going down, but where we tend to strike is somewhere around 9s and 10s. And for most people, that tends to be where we are. But we need to understand that's a BBB rating. You can get long-term borrowing with restrictions. You will pay more than Treasury for any lending you do. It's on the edge of the what I would call an area between the good and the negatives. So maintaining this and looking at it on an annual basis really makes some sense, and it's something I would share with my banker as just a way of building some level of credibility about how we manage at our organization.
Yeah, I think that showing that to the banker is really important. It is something we monitor internally, but it does have that external validation that's going to speak. That average of 9, 10. It's rare that I've seen organizations in our market that have actually been higher than that, although I did an assessment on an organization this morning that ended up with a 10. I actually have done some strategy work over the last few months where organizations have been in the 5 to 8 range, and actually even had an organization that was in the 3 to 5 range. And so I think this is a validated tool that takes the metrics and converts it to this external analysis. The other tool that we've integrated into our financial strength assessment is the Financial Vulnerability Index. Once again, a lot of research has gone into this vulnerability index, and it uses a lot of complex calculations, but the calculations are based once again on your debt ratio. So how much debt do you have? What's your concentration of revenue? We talked about that at the very beginning. I like bringing in your revenue concentration. It's something that the previous index doesn't look at, but if I'm highly concentrated in just a couple payers or just 2 or 3 revenue sources, service lines, That's risky. What's our net margin? And what's that net margin over time, over a couple of year period of time, 2 to 3 years? What's that administrative ratio? You know, once again, is that too high? Is that really a point that it's creating some vulnerability for us? And then I do like this ratio also because it looks at organizational size. It compares that to our particular industry. And so taking those 5 different factors and putting that together, we end up with some assessment overall that we can compare on a time trend. You know, is our trend positive or negative? We can compare that to a benchmark for healthcare organizations overall. Are we better? Are we worse? And then it calculates our financial vulnerability. If we end up with a score over 0.2, we're a vulnerable organization. We need to dig down into these issues, these metrics, and understand what's making us vulnerable. And if we are under a 0.2, in the case of this particular example organization at a 0.15, we don't have as much financial vulnerability. So I like a tool like this too, because it's pulling in organizational size and revenue concentration.
I haven't had as much experience with this tool as you have. I know you've done such extensive work on building it out and having it flow to this structure. But it is incredibly important for people to consider their vulnerabilities at this point. It's separate and apart from their credit score. The financial vulnerability tells them a lot about what could potentially go wrong and how it might impact them. It's a good view of the future and the risks that lie there. I like it a lot, Ken.
Yeah, I think it's yet another tool that we can use, and it's a validated tool, and being able to monitor it internally, the CFO communicating to the rest of the leadership team is important. So Ray, we just have a few minutes here. I'd like to, we've got a couple slides on portfolio analysis, because now we spent a lot of time talking about the metrics. What metrics are important, the importance of measuring them in a timely basis, utilizing them to assess overall strength or vulnerability organization. But really, we utilize these tools so that we can create strategy for a stronger organization, more profitability, more growth, more competitive advantage. And so one of the tools that you and I have used a lot as we move into the strategy standpoint of strengthening our financial side of the organization's portfolio analysis. So would like you to maybe talk a little bit about the value portfolio analysis, and we have an example of that. Then we'll tie things up, and maybe we'll have a few minutes for some questions at the end as well from our participants.
Thank you, Ken. I like this kind of look, because let's say we do all of this analysis and we find numbers that are unsettling. We're not comfortable with the position of our organization. The issue comes down to, now what? What do you do at this point to change that? Not just on a short-term basis, like where do I cut, but on a long-term basis about changing your structure. And so I do like the idea that portfolio analysis, looking at each of your service lines separate and apart from each other and determining their viability, is an important way for us to plan. It should be done with all due respect to the mission, the vision, and the values of the company. It should flow from that sense of who you are and who you need to be, and maybe bring tension to that around potential new populations where your skill sets can be used to add in needed services in your community. But starting with the mission, vision, and values, then moving on to what does the future bring? What will be needed for me to live in a value-based world? What services do I perform that supplant or replace services performed by others that are more expensive? What do I do that has the most effective outcomes for the people we serve? And if so, can I prove that? Can I show that? We need to be diversifying, for the simple reason that being too concentrated in one area of our portfolio is no more viable than being overly revenue concentrated. So in that regard, we need to see how we're spread out. But it is an objective methodology to use when making and plotting those processes in the future, because this is a source of enormous internal conflict when you're talking about growing or decreasing the size of some of the services you offer in terms of maybe assisting others. The graphic that we use on this is on the next slide, and it is an interesting three-dimensional approach to the view. Each of those dots represents a service line. You can see I've created some dots and based on the definitions that an organization might have given. And you can see that they are of different size. That size represents their total expense run in terms of the agency. Mental health services far and away in this organization consumes the greatest amount of resources, followed by addiction and residential. Senior services and employment barely use much resources at all. But resources is only one of the three lines. The size then is placed on a graph that compares profitability over a 2 or 3 year period to growth over that 2 or 3 year period. Those that are growing appear more to your right. Those that are profitable appear more to the top. So that upper quadrant really shows us who is growing and profitable. These are incredibly important service lines for us to continue because the environment has shown us the importance by making it an important service in terms of payment and an important service in terms of growth. On the other end of the spectrum, that lower left-hand side, are people who are reducing in size and showing negative profitability. Questions have to be asked here about what these elements are doing. Are they simply pulling away the profitability from that upper quadrant without any real benefit to the organization? The other two elements, particularly those that are high growth but not quite profitable, are areas that we probably need to redesign or invest in to bring new resources to. Maybe at a little bit larger size, they do better. Maybe at a little bit more in terms of marketing, we can improve them and bring them to the profitability level. Those that are shrinking but still profitable probably are on the downward slope of their maturity and would be something that we would maintain and use those profits to grow other areas of the organization. But if we look at this, it clearly points us to one or two programs that the economy is telling us are not going to grow, and the dollars are telling us we can't sustain. And as we move and look at the other end of that, we can see enormous profitability and enormous growth. So I would ask in this regard, what now is needed? What do value-based reimbursement organizations want that we could shift into? And how would we shift money and where would we shift it from? Obviously, I've noted the quadrant where I would begin to shift resources. But this kind of approach provides some grounding, some 30,000-foot view of where we stand strategically and what we need to do and where the money needs to come from to get there. We're simply not going to take $10 million out of our cash reserves and build a new program because we often don't have $10 million in cash reserves. It has to be obtained by shifting from other elements of our portfolio. And just like a stock portfolio, we slowly remove money from those that are not performing well and we apply it to those who are. And Then taking your ratios, understanding the urgency and need, and using this kind of analysis to define how we reach that 3 to 5% profitability, how we find the funds along with our debt management to grow our company, becomes critical to the real management process we need.
Yeah, and I really like this approach, and Ray, I know you've worked a lot to develop this particular graph that we use, which kind of moves beyond two-dimensional. It's really more of a three-dimensional view of the service portfolio. And often when we do strategy work, we're working with maybe the executive team, we're working with the board and educating as CFOs. We'll pull the numbers and we'll have our columns of numbers, and those just don't speak as well, especially to non-financial people. And so having a graphic like this can speak volumes. And I look at this and I agree, kind of looking quadrant to quadrant, looking at size, looking at growth, looking at profitability. As an analyst, I would look at this and say, compare this in our organization to maybe what I know is happening in the market based upon some market intelligence, this growth of senior services, especially in the community. I would say, so our senior services are losing money and shrinking, but there's a big need in the community. Is this an area that we need to re-engineer totally? Maybe, because we look at those main questions around, should we close a service line? Should we reorganize it? Should we try to expand it with marketing? We just need to re-engineer. Do we just really need to market that we're doing a good job and expand our payer base? So looking at a service like that, residential services, maybe the need has decreased, or maybe it's a undifferentiated residential service where the payers really want a very specific service for a specific population that could grow and make that residential service line profitable. So really looking at those areas, and then what white space is there? Is there a service when we look at the market and then we look internally that just isn't lined up in this particular portfolio of services? So, what might we add that we just are missing? And it's an opportunity to create a new service. So I think the whole idea of portfolio analysis, using a lot of those metrics earlier to identify where are we strong, where are we weak, but now how can we grow and create some strategy moving into the future? Portfolio analysis is really that first step from a strategy perspective. So yes. We have just a few minutes, just once again to kind of summarize some of our thoughts and then see if there are any questions that have come in as well as we've been moving through this presentation. One key thing is we need to be using these standard ratios. We need to be using them on a timely basis. They help us manage what's important for financial performance, and they help us compare to other organizations. So those ratios are really key. We need to utilize them as we look at our portfolio of services. So, how can we bring these metrics in, especially the profitability piece, the growth piece in? And we need to really be looking at utilizing all of this information to assess how strong are we or how vulnerable are we, using some of those indexes, because our conversation as CFOs for moving along financial performance strategy, strengthening the organization, creating an organization that has sustainability in the future starts by our ability to communicate with the executive team, with the board of directors, but it moves outside the organization as we communicate with our capital funding sources as well. So pulling all of this together, creating some strategy, bringing people along to build that sustainable organization is what a lot of this that we've talked about today is about.
And we began this with a conversation about the problems and the urgency of the industry. Frankly, right now, finance and sustainability and the ability to have money to make quick and nimble moves is clearly a key element of any strategy at this point. Financial growth and sustainability ought to be in that regard. I would add that the ratios that you showed ought to be used in some regard as budgets, that we ought to, in approving a budget, also have a conversation about what do we believe the lowest level of liquidity ought to be, and what would we do if we reached it, and to be able to pre-manage through scenarios how those kind of factors might impact us and what we would do in the short term to address them. The idea of a simple balance sheet and income statement is kind of obsolete when we're looking at the kind of complex worlds that we presently have.
Yeah, you know, and it reminds me, Ray, of the changing role of the CFO. We've talked about that over time, over the last few years, but I think it's accelerated. And I think the old role of the CFO really being more of the manager of the accounting system is past. You know, the role of the CFO today is kind of, we've talked a little bit of, you know, the visual of the co-pilot to the pilot. You know, the CFO needs to know everything that the CEO knows and be able to also drive financial strategy along the way. To move away from, you know, a lot of that focus of closing the books, putting out the traditional statements, presenting them to the board of directors, doing some variance analysis, to really putting in place key ratios that assess strength, that give opportunity for strategy moving forward. And so this changing role of the CFO to focus on strategy, to focus on timely performance, and you know, be the holder, that's key. And that's a big part of what we at Open Minds will be doing this year. I know next month, Ray, you and I will be hosting the CFO Summit in Clearwater. And it'll be an opportunity for CFOs to come together. We will be looking at some of these key questions around the changing role, around how do we prepare for growth in this next normal market? How do we get capital and utilize that in a strategic way, building programs around ROI, and then just this whole concept of creating the right size organization to be efficient and sustainable into the future. And as we move through this year, we'll be engaging in conversations with CFOs that we can all learn from each other and strengthen our organizations with what we believe will be some of the best tools and resources financially.
I really am looking forward to that. We've talked a long time about a CFO summit and the importance of bringing CFOs together to understand this changing role, to share stories and ideas and thoughts with each other, and to get grounded in what are really far more commercial CFO sorts of activities and endeavors, and a different way of culturally thinking. I'm looking forward to being there with you and to the folks that we're going to meet and work with down there, and to hearing what they have to say and how they'll contribute to this development.
Thanks, Ray. I don't think we have any questions. I've appreciated the opportunity to share with you just some of our thoughts around financial metrics for monitoring performance, for assessing the strength of the organization, and then for figuring out strategy moving ahead to create sustainable organizations. So thank you for the opportunity to share today together. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you both. The amazing information that you shared. And again, as Ray said up at the beginning, in a very easy to understand format that can be taken back and really shared with board members, team members, to make sure that we really are looking at the future today so that everyone is prepared. And as you mentioned, not only will we have the CFO consortium in Florida, but throughout this year, we will continue to have these discussions quarterly. We encourage everyone to keep an eye on the Circle Elite Executive Roundtable series for our CFO topics that you will continue to see. As we mentioned, this particular session today will be available starting tomorrow, both the recording of this presentation as well as the deck and all of the pertinent information that was shared in it. We encourage you to download that. And we encourage you to join us for our next roundtable, which is actually scheduled for Thursday, February 3rd. And we will be presenting Breaking Barriers, Addressing Institutional and Structural Racism in Health and Human Services, featuring Suzanne Cole, President and CEO of Presley Ridge, and Joyce James with Joyce James Consulting. Ray will join us again. That's what happens when you speak too quickly. Ray will join us again that day to help moderate the session and discuss this very important topic. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Bye-bye.